Martha Jefferson stood at the window on the second floor of Monticello, her hand pressed against the cold glass. Below her, on the garden path that led toward the slave quarters, she watched her husband walking beside a young woman whose belly had begun to swell beneath her plain cotton dress. Thomas did not touch her. He did not look at her directly, yet there was something in the careful space he kept between them, exactly 3 feet. Martha knew the distance well. She had measured it in her mind over weeks of watching, and it told her everything she needed to understand. She had felt the suspicion growing for months, the way Sally Hemings now moved through the house with a quiet confidence she had not had before. The way Thomas's eyes followed her when he believed no one was paying attention. The way conversations stopped the moment Martha entered a room. The way Sally's dresses had been let out twice in just a few months, the stitches neat and hidden, yet obvious to someone who knew where to look. Suspicion, however, was not the same as certainty. Martha's reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale, thin, worn down by 6 pregnancies and a constant pain in her chest that no doctor could explain. She was only 33 years old, yet she looked closer to 50. Sally Hemings was 16. She shone with youth, health, and something else, something that should have belonged only to Martha. The window clouded with her breath. When it cleared again, Thomas and Sally had vanished around the corner near the dependencies. Martha remained at the window for another hour, staring at the empty path as the sun slowly sank and long shadows stretched across the Virginia hills. That night, she began to write letters she never intended to send, letters that would vanish along with her, leaving behind nothing but questions that would echo for centuries. What truly happened to Martha Jefferson in the spring of 1782? Why did a woman who had never left her husband's side suddenly disappear from all records for 3 crucial months? And why, when she finally returned, was she changed so deeply, silent and hollow, as if something essential had been cut away from her? The answers lie buried in Virginia's red clay, in the spaces between what history chose to record and what actually occurred. This is the story of a wife, a slave, a founding father, and a secret so dangerous it had to be erased from every document, every letter, every memory. Yet secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface. If you want to hear more disturbing stories from America's hidden past, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the men who built this nation. Monticello in early 1782 was not yet the architectural masterpiece it would one day become. The main house was still unfinished, a project always in progress, much like Thomas Jefferson's restless mind. Bare beams jutted from half-built walls. Scaffolding clung to the western side of the house. The scent of fresh-cut wood and damp plaster filled every room. Workers, both paid craftsmen and enslaved laborers, moved through the structure like shadows, constructing a monument that would trap them all in different ways. Thomas Jefferson, 38 years old at the time, had returned from his troubled term as Virginia's wartime governor to find his home unfinished and his wife's health failing. The Revolutionary War still burned on, though the fighting had shifted south. British troops under Cornwallis had invaded Virginia the year before, forcing Jefferson to flee Richmond, an act his enemies called cowardice and his allies called caution. The ordeal left him shaken and eager to retreat into private life and the intellectual pursuits he loved most. But life at Monticello was far from calm. Martha Wales Skelton had married Thomas 10 years earlier, in 1772. She brought with her a large inheritance, including 135 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings and her children, including a baby girl named Sally. Long before Martha's marriage, whispers had followed the Hemings family. Everyone in Virginia society knew, though few spoke aloud, that Elizabeth Hemings's children were fathered by John Wales, Martha's own father. That meant Sally was Martha's half-sister, tied by blood yet separated by the cruel rules of slavery. Martha had grown up knowing this truth. She had watched her father move between the main house and the slave quarters with the ease of a man who believed he owned not only labor, but bodies and futures. She had seen her mother's face tighten whenever Elizabeth Hemings appeared. She learned early that some truths were spoken only through silence. After her mother's death, John Wales openly took Elizabeth Hemings as his concubine, no longer pretending otherwise. He fathered 6 more children with her, each one a living reminder of the system's deep corruption. Martha, still very young, was forced to accept these half-siblings as property. She gave them orders. She took part in the lie that blood meant nothing once it crossed the color line. She promised herself that her own marriage would be different, that Thomas, with his talk of liberty and human dignity, would never behave as her father had. She was wrong. The plantation ran with the harsh efficiency common to Virginia estates. Nearly 200 enslaved people worked the tobacco fields, vegetable gardens, nail factory, textile shop, and the house itself. They built walls that confined them. They cooked meals they would never share. They raised children who could be taken from them at any moment. They created wealth they would never enjoy, supporting grand ideas of freedom on a foundation of bondage. Thomas Jefferson kept careful records of nearly everything: crop yields, weather notes, construction details, births and deaths of enslaved people, tracked with the same care he gave to his garden plants. His journals from this time still exist, thousands of pages filled with observations about soil, architecture, and philosophical thoughts on liberty and happiness. Yet from March through May of 1782, there is nothing. 12 weeks of silence in an otherwise exact record. 12 weeks Thomas Jefferson wanted erased. Martha had given birth to their 6th child, Lucy Elizabeth, in May of 1781. The birth was difficult, made worse by Martha's already fragile health and the crude medical care of the time. The doctor used forceps, causing internal injuries that never healed properly. Martha bled for weeks afterward, losing so much blood she often fainted when she tried to stand. She lived, but she never truly recovered. Most days were spent in bed, too weak to walk without help. Pain lived constantly in her abdomen, dull at times, sharp and unbearable when she moved. Doctors came and went, each confident, none effective. They gave her laudanum for pain, which helped but left her mind cloudy. They ordered bloodletting for weakness, which only drained her further. They prescribed bed rest, fresh air, and bitter tonics that tasted like poison and likely were. Nothing worked. Martha was slowly dying, and everyone knew it. Thomas hired more house servants to tend to her. Sally Hemings, newly 15, was brought from the weaving house where she had been learning textile work. She was given light tasks, carrying meals to Martha's room, changing sheets, reading aloud when Martha's eyes grew tired, sitting nearby in case she was needed. Sally was strikingly beautiful, with light skin inherited from her white father and soft features that made strangers mistake her for family rather than property. Her hazel eyes were rare among the slave quarters, and her hair fell in gentle waves instead of tight curls. She was also intelligent, quick to learn, observant in ways that unsettled some people. She could read, a skill Elizabeth Hemings had quietly taught her children despite the law. She could play the harpsichord, having learned by listening to Martha's lessons and practicing when the house was empty. In her illness, Martha grew fond of the girl. Sally reminded her of herself at that age, before marriage, before children, before hope slowly faded from loving a man who loved ideas more than people. Martha taught Sally French, reading aloud from Voltaire and Rousseau, finding bitter irony in teaching enlightenment, thought to a girl with no rights at all. They sat together for hours, Martha in bed, Sally beside her, discussing ideas they both knew would never change Sally's place as property. But Thomas saw something else in Sally, something that would undo everything. It began in February of 1782, during one of the coldest winters Virginia had ever known. Ice formed inside the windows, creating crystal patterns like frozen flowers. The James River froze solid for the first time. In memory, thick enough for people to walk across it. Enslaved families burned through their small wood supplies within weeks and spent the rest of the winter huddled together, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. 3 children died of pneumonia in a single week. Their graves had to be dug by lighting fires to soften the frozen ground. Martha's health worsened with the cold. She could no longer leave her bed. Her skin turned a grey pallor that made her look already dead. Her breathing grew strained, each breath an effort. She coughed constantly, bringing up blood that stained her handkerchiefs. The doctors called it consumption, though they could not explain why their usual treatments had no effect at all. They began speaking in quiet, careful voices about keeping her comfortable, about preparing the family for what could not be avoided. Thomas spent his days in his study, supposedly working on revisions to the Virginia legal code. He had been asked to reshape the state's laws to align them with Republican ideas. It was the kind of work that should have absorbed him completely, the sort of challenge he usually enjoyed. But the house servants noticed that he seemed unsettled, that papers lay on his desk for days untouched, that he stared out the window for long stretches of time. They also noticed that Sally Hemings was often sent to bring him tea, to tend the fire, to deliver notes that anyone else could have carried. And they noticed that these tasks took far longer than they should have. Sally would enter the study with a tray and not come out for nearly an hour. The door would remain closed. No sound came from inside, and when Sally finally appeared, her face was flushed, her hair slightly disturbed, her eyes carefully avoiding everyone around her. The other house servants began to murmur among themselves. Betty Brown, who had served the Jefferson family for 20 years, told her daughter she had seen Thomas touch Sally's hand when she brought him tea, a touch that lingered longer than politeness allowed. Ursula, the cook, said she had heard voices coming from the study late at night, Thomas's low voice and Sally's softer replies. Martin Hemings, Sally's brother and Thomas's personal servant, said nothing at all, but his face tightened with anger whenever Sally's name was spoken. Martha noticed as well. Even through the fog of laudanum, she saw the way Thomas looked at Sally. She heard footsteps moving through the halls late at night, the quiet closing of doors, the hushed conversations that stopped when she called out. She noticed that Sally had new dresses, made from better cloth than the other house servants wore. She noticed that Sally was excused from the hardest labor, that she was granted privileges that stirred resentment among the other enslaved people. And she noticed, with a sick certainty that cut through the haze of the drug, that Sally's body was changing. The girl's breasts were fuller, her face held a strange glow, her dresses were being loosened at the waist. Sally Hemings was pregnant in early March. Martha summoned her sister, Elizabeth Epps, to Monticello. The message was urgent, carried by a rider through freezing rain. Elizabeth arrived 2 days later and found Martha in a state of agitation, unusual for someone so weak. Martha was sitting upright in bed, her eyes bright with fever or fury, or perhaps both. She had refused her laudanum that morning, wanting her thoughts clear. Martha sent the servants away and spoke to her sister in urgent whispers for more than an hour. The door was shut, but Betty Brown, cleaning in the hallway, heard pieces of their conversation. She heard Martha say, "Pregnant, in my own house, my father's child." She heard Elizabeth's shocked replies, her efforts to calm Martha, her suggestions that Martha might be mistaken. But Martha was not wrong. She had proof. She had been watching, recording, noting dates, times, and details in a small journal hidden beneath her mattress. She had written down every time Sally entered Thomas's study, every time Thomas went to the slave quarters at night, every time Sally's dresses were altered. She had counted the days and calculated the timing, determining that Sally was about 3 months along. And she had a plan. No record remains of exactly what Martha told her sister that day. But Elizabeth left Monticello that same afternoon, her face pale and strained, and she never spoke of the visit to anyone. She rode away in the rain and did not look back at the house. 2 days later, Sally Hemings appeared at breakfast with a bruise on her cheek, a dark purple mark spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw. When Betty Brown asked what had happened, Sally said she had slipped on ice. But there was no ice inside the house, and Sally's eyes told another story. They were red from crying, and they carried a fear deeper than physical pain. That night, Martha Jefferson left her bed for the first time in weeks. Several servants saw her walking through the house in her nightgown, holding a candle, moving with surprising strength for someone said to be dying. Her face was set with grim resolve. She went to Thomas's study. The door closed. Voices rose, Martha's sharp and cutting, carrying through the walls. Thomas's voice was low and defensive, trying to quiet her. The argument lasted over an hour. Servants gathered in the halls, pretending to work while straining to hear. They caught fragments. "Your own house, my father's child, everyone will know, destroy everything." Then came silence, a long, dreadful silence that felt worse than the shouting. When the door finally opened, Thomas came out alone. His face was carefully calm, but his hands were trembling. He ordered all servants to go to bed at once. His voice was cold and allowed no resistance. The servants scattered, but watched from windows and doorways as Thomas locked himself in his study for the rest of the night. A single candle burned in the window until morning. The next day, Martha Jefferson was gone. At sunrise, Thomas gathered the household staff in the main hall. His face looked worn, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his voice was steady. He announced that Martha had been taken during the night to a specialist doctor in Richmond. Her condition had worsened suddenly, he said, and she needed care that could only be given in the city. She would be away for several weeks, perhaps longer. Until then, the household was to function as usual. No one was to speak of Martha's absence to visitors. Anyone spreading rumors would be punished severely. The servants listened quietly. They knew better than to question him, but they also knew the story did not make sense. First, Martha was far too sick to travel. The journey to Richmond was more than 70 miles over rough roads, a trip that took at least 3 days in good conditions. In March, with rain and melting snow, it could take a week. The jolting carriage, the cold air, the lack of rest, any of these could easily kill someone in Martha's state. No doctor would advise such travel. No husband who cared for his wife's life would allow it. Second, if Martha had truly been sent to Richmond, there would have been preparation. Trunks would have been packed, plans made for her care, messages sent ahead to arrange lodging and alert the doctor. None of this happened. Martha's room looked exactly as it had the night before. Her clothes remained in the wardrobe. Her personal items still sat on the dressing table. If she had left for months, she had taken nothing. Third, Thomas made no effort to visit her. For a man claiming devotion to his dying wife, he showed little concern for her treatment. He stayed at Monticello, managing the plantation, overseeing construction, and spending an unusual amount of time in the slave quarters. He sent no letters asking about Martha's condition. He received no updates from the supposed doctor. He behaved like a man who knew exactly where his wife was and had no fear for her safety. The enslaved community at Monticello formed their own explanations. These ideas were passed down quietly through generations, whispered in the quarters late at night, never written, but never forgotten. They were shared in the careful language enslaved people used to speak dangerous truths, indirect words, heavy silences, stories that sounded like they were about others but were really about the masters. They said Martha had learned the truth about Thomas and Sally. They said she had confronted him with proof that could ruin his name, a man who wrote of liberty while forcing himself on an enslaved girl who was also his wife's half-sister. They said Thomas had been forced to choose between his reputation and his wife, and they said he chose his reputation. But where was Martha? If she had not gone to Richmond, where had she been taken? And why did Thomas work so hard to hide her location? The answer lay in a place that no longer appears on any map, a place deliberately erased from history along with Martha herself. About 30 miles west of Monticello, deep in the mountains that form the backbone of Virginia, there was once a small settlement called Shadwell Mills. It had been founded by Peter Jefferson, Thomas's father, in the 1740s as a business venture. The settlement included a grist mill powered by a fast-moving creek, a few outbuildings for storage and tools, and a one house set back from the road on a slight rise. The house was solid, built to endure, with thick fieldstone walls and a slate roof strong enough to survive harsh winters. It was meant to house the mill manager, but the mill never succeeded. The location was too remote, too hard to reach, too far from major trade paths. By 1760, the mill had been abandoned. The outbuildings fell apart. The stone house stood empty, slowly taken over by the forest. Thomas inherited the property after his father's death, but he rarely went there. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, reached only by a narrow path often impassable in winter and spring. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away. It was the kind of place where someone could vanish completely, where screams would be swallowed by the trees, where no one would ever know what happened behind those thick stone walls. In March of 1782, smoke was seen rising from the stone house's chimney for the first time in many years. A local hunter named William Crawford was tracking deer through the mountains when he noticed something odd. It struck him as strange right away. He moved closer with care and saw signs that the stone house had been used recently. The windows were shut tight from the inside. Fresh-cut firewood was neatly stacked near the door. A carriage stood where a yard once was, now choked with tall weeds. Crawford stayed hidden along the tree line for more than an hour, watching closely. During that time, he saw 2 enslaved men from Monticello. He knew them from past visits when he had sold game to the plantation. They carried supplies into the house, buckets of water from the creek, armloads of firewood, a basket that looked heavy with food. They worked quietly, with the careful speed of men doing a task they did not want to do. Their faces were hard, set with grim resolve. Then Crawford heard a sound that made his blood turn cold. A woman's voice, high, panicked, screaming from inside the house. He could not make out the words, but the pain in the voice was clear. The scream went on and on, climbing higher, sharper, until it stopped suddenly, as if a hand had been clamped over her mouth. The 2 enslaved men froze. They looked at one another, their expressions carefully empty. Then they went back to their work. They finished unloading the supplies and left, driving the carriage back down the narrow path toward Monticello. Crawford waited until they were gone. Only then did he approach the house. He tried to peer through the shuttered windows, but they were sealed tight. He tested the door. It was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock, the kind that needed a key. He called out, asking if anyone inside needed help. There was no answer. Uneasy and shaken, he rode to the nearest town and spoke of what he had seen to a friend at the tavern. The friend, Robert Hughes, a man who did business with Jefferson, told Crawford he must be wrong. No one was living at Shadwell Mills. The place had been abandoned for years. Maybe Crawford had seen squatters. Maybe the loneliness of the mountains had played tricks on his mind. But Crawford knew better. He knew what his eyes had seen. He knew what his ears had heard. A woman was being kept in that stone house against her will, and everyone seemed determined to act as if nothing was happening. Within a week, whispers spread through Albemarle County. People murmured that Thomas Jefferson was keeping his wife hidden in the mountains. Some said Martha had lost her mind and needed to be restrained for her own good. Others claimed she had tried to kill herself and was being stopped from trying again. Still others said she had learned something about Thomas, something he could never allow her to reveal. Thomas acted fast to crush the rumors. He went to see Robert Hughes in person and calmly suggested that spreading lies about a governor's family could be seen as sedition, a serious offense in wartime Virginia. He reminded Hughes, gently but clearly, that he had the power to make life very hard for those who opposed him. Hughes understood and stopped speaking about Shadwell Mills. Thomas also visited the tavern, where Crawford had first spoken. He talked with the owner, Samuel Porter, and made his wishes clear. He did not threaten him outright. Thomas Jefferson did not need crude threats. Instead, he mentioned that he was reviewing tavern licenses in the county, and that some places might not meet the new standards he was considering. Porter understood immediately. When Crawford returned and tried to speak again, Porter shut him down. He warned him that some matters were best left alone, that powerful men never forgot, that a hunter who wished to keep hunting on Jefferson's land should learn when to stay silent. Soon after, Crawford was offered a large sum of money, £50, more than he could earn in a year. The offer came with a suggestion: leave Virginia, start a new life in Kentucky. The money came from Thomas Jefferson's personal funds, though it passed through another man, so there would be no clear link. Crawford took the offer. He left Virginia in April of 1782 and was never heard from again. Whether he reached Kentucky or met some darker fate on the road, no one knows. The 2 enslaved men assigned to Shadwell Mills, Jupiter Evans and George Granger, were sold to a plantation in Georgia within a month of Martha's disappearance. The sale raised questions. Both men were skilled, valuable, and had families at Monticello. Selling them meant tearing families apart, separating husbands from wives, fathers from children, something Thomas Jefferson publicly claimed he tried to avoid. But Jupiter and George knew too much. They had seen Martha Jefferson in captivity. They had heard her screams and her pleas. They had been forced to help keep her imprisoned, bringing food, water, and firewood, helping maintain the lie that she was being cared for when she was being broken instead. They were sent far away, to a place where no one would believe them even if they spoke, isolated, cut off, their knowledge buried with them. Jupiter died in 1790, killed in an accident on the Georgia plantation. George lived until 1808. but he never spoke of Shadwell Mills. The truth died with him, or so Thomas Jefferson believed. But one person still knew. One person had been there in those first terrible weeks. One person had seen Martha in her confinement, heard her accusations, witnessed the slow destruction of her mind and spirit. Sally Hemings knew, and Sally Hemings was carrying Thomas Jefferson's child. By April, Sally's condition could no longer be hidden. Her belly swelled beneath her dresses, plain for anyone to see. The other enslaved women whispered among themselves, their voices filled with both pity and bitterness. Some felt deep sympathy for Sally. She was barely 16, still a child, and everyone knew she had no choice. When the master wanted something, an enslaved woman could not refuse. It was rape in every sense, though no one dared use the word. They called it taking advantage, or having his way, or simply what masters did. Others felt resentment. Sally's pregnancy looked like favor, like closeness to the master that could bring comfort. She already had better quarters, lighter work, finer clothes. Now she carried the master's child, a child that might be treated differently from the rest. It created a quiet division among them, a hierarchy of favor and neglect. Sally herself spoke to no one. She moved through the house like a shadow, doing her work with dull precision. Her face showed nothing. She made no complaints. She asked for nothing. She told no one what had happened between her and Thomas Jefferson. She endured, as enslaved women had always endured, carrying a weight she never chose and could never put down. Thomas said nothing in public, but he made arrangements. Sally was moved from the main house to a small cabin near the stables, away from the others. The cabin was better than most slave quarters, a wooden floor instead of bare earth, a real fireplace, a proper bed. She received better food, warmer blankets, and was excused from hard labor. A midwife visited her often, watching over the pregnancy. Everyone noticed these favors. No one fully understood them. Why was Thomas Jefferson showing such care for an enslaved girl? He had never done this for the many other enslaved women who had given birth at Monticello. Their pregnancies were written into his farm book like livestock records, dates, outcomes, survival, nothing more. But Sally was different. She was treated almost like family. The whispers grew stronger. Some said the child was Jefferson's, pointing to the special treatment. Others said that was impossible. A man like Jefferson would never do such a thing, they claimed. They said Sally must have been with an enslaved man, and Jefferson was simply being kind. But the enslaved people knew the truth. They had seen Thomas visit Sally's cabin at night. They had seen his hand on hers when he thought no one watched. They had heard Sally crying afterward, soft sobs she tried to hide. They knew exactly what was happening, and they knew they were powerless to stop it. Late in April, a letter arrived at Monticello from Elizabeth Epps, Martha's sister. It was cold and formal. Unlike her usual letters, she demanded to see Martha. She had written to the doctor in Richmond and received no answer. She had contacted other doctors, and all said they were not treating Martha Jefferson. Elizabeth threatened to come herself, to search, to involve family, to ask questions of the Virginia government. Thomas replied at once. His letter, preserved in the EPZ family papers, was a careful blend of reassurance and warning. He insisted Martha was receiving the best care. He said her condition was slowly improving. He promised she would return home once she was strong enough to travel. He urged Elizabeth to be patient, to trust him, to understand that Martha needed total rest and complete isolation to have any chance of recovery. Any disturbance, any visitors, any emotional strain could undo her progress or even end her life. He added, almost in passing, that he had recently updated his will. He explained that he had made generous arrangements for Elizabeth and her children, ensuring they would be financially safe, even if something were to happen to him. He said he hoped she would find these arrangements acceptable. He enclosed copies of the relevant passages, clearly outlining the exact sums Elizabeth and her children would receive. The message was unmistakable. Silence had a price. Cooperation would be rewarded. Interference would be costly. Elizabeth did not travel to Monticello, but she did not stop asking questions either. She wrote letters to friends in Richmond, to physicians, to anyone who might know where Martha was or what condition she was in. She was careful and polite, never openly accusing Thomas of wrongdoing. Still, her persistence posed a danger. She was creating written evidence of her concern, a trail of letters that could later be used against Thomas if Martha never returned, or if she returned in a state that raised troubling questions. Thomas needed Martha to be seen again. But the woman confined in the stone house at Shadwell Mills was no longer able to play the role of Virginia's First Lady. The servants sent to care for Martha during her isolation, a rotating group of enslaved women brought to Shadwell Mills for a few days at a time before being sent back to Monticello, returned with disturbing accounts. Late at night, in the quarters, they whispered to one another, sharing what they had witnessed in voices barely audible. Martha had stopped eating properly. She would take a few bites, then push the plate away, insisting the food was poisoned. She had grown so thin that her bones pressed visibly against her skin. Her hair, once thick and shining, was coming out in handfuls. She had pulled much of it out herself, leaving raw, bald patches on her scalp. She spent long hours staring at the stone walls, silent and unresponsive. At other times, without warning, she would begin speaking in fast, tangled streams of words that made little sense, pieces of prayers mixed with accusations, pleas for mercy mixed with anger. She spoke of Sally, of the baby, of betrayal and revenge. She spoke of her father, of the Hemmings family, of the deep corruption of the world they all lived in. And she had carved words into the stone walls with her fingernails. The women who saw these marks were terrified. Some were Bible verses about adultery and punishment. Others were accusations against Thomas, calling him a hypocrite and a liar. Some were threats, promises of revenge Martha could never fulfill. And some were simple, desperate pleas. Please let me out. Please let me out. I will be good. I will be quiet. Just let me out. Her fingernails were cracked and bloody from clawing at the stone. The women tried to wrap her hands, but she would rip the cloth away and begin scratching again. It was as though she believed she could escape by force of will alone, tearing her way through the walls. A doctor was eventually summoned. A well-known specialist from Richmond, but a discreet physician from Staunton named Dr. William Carr, a man known for handling difficult cases and for keeping his silence. Dr. Carr spent an hour alone with Martha and came out visibly shaken. He told Thomas that Martha was suffering from severe melancholia, possibly worsened by brain fever. Her mind, he said, might have been permanently damaged by the combination of illness, emotional trauma, and prolonged isolation. He advised continued isolation, laudanum for agitation, and prayer. He said Martha might recover with time, or she might never recover at all. Bringing her back into society in her present condition, he warned, would be disastrous. She would make wild accusations, behave unpredictably, and disgrace the family. It would be better to keep her isolated until she either improved or died. He did not suggest returning her to her family. He did not recommend allowing visitors. He did not question why a woman supposedly receiving medical care was locked in an abandoned house in the mountains, instead of a proper hospital or asylum. Dr. Carr was paid £100 for his consultation and his silence. He returned to Staunton and never spoke of Martha Jefferson again when he died in 1795. His widow burned his personal papers, saying only that her husband had treated many patients whose privacy needed to be protected even after death. Still, Thomas's situation was becoming impossible. Elizabeth's inquiries were drawing notice. Other relatives were beginning to ask why they had not heard from Martha in months. Guests at Monticello remarked on her absence, expressing worry and offering assistance. The story of the Richmond doctor was no longer believable. Eventually, someone would go looking for Martha themselves, and when no trace of her was found, questions would turn into accusations. In mid-May, Thomas mad. His choice. Martha would return to Monticello, but she would return altered, broken, unable to tell anyone what had been done to her. The question remained whether 3 months of isolation and grief had already destroyed her, or whether Thomas took further steps to guarantee her silence. On May 20th, 1782, Martha Jefferson returned to Monticello. She arrived before sunrise, brought in a closed carriage that drove straight to the main house without stopping. The servants were ordered to remain in their quarters until after dawn. No one was to witness her arrival. No one was to mention it. But enslaved people learned to see what they were not meant to see. Their survival depended on it. They had to know the master's movements, their moods, their intentions while appearing invisible. A young girl named Betsy, who worked in the kitchen, was awake early, as she always was, lighting fires for the morning meal. Bread had to be baked, porridge had to be prepared, coffee needed to be ready before the household stirred. As she carried wood from the shed, she saw the carriage arrive. She froze in the shadows, making herself small and silent, and watched. Thomas stepped down first. He looked worn and exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his face drawn and haggard. He had been gone for 2 days, supposedly on business in Charlottesville, though everyone knew he had gone to Shadwell Mills to bring Martha back. He reached into the carriage and helped a woman emerge. She moved slowly and uncertainly, like someone who had forgotten how to walk. She was so thin she looked like bones wrapped in cloth. Her dress hung loose on her frame, far too large for her. Her face was hollow, her cheeks sunken, her eyes unnaturally large. But it was her hair that shocked Betsy most. Martha Jefferson's hair had once been thick and dark, a source of pride. The woman stepping from the carriage had high, streaked with white, as if she had aged decades in a matter of months. It was thin and brittle, with bare patches where it had fallen out entirely. Thomas held her around the waist, nearly carrying her up the steps. Martha, though she barely resembled herself, said nothing. She did not look around. She moved mechanically, following Thomas's guidance, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. Betsy later said, many years later, when she was old and Thomas Jefferson had long been dead, that the woman who returned to Monticello was not the woman who had left. She said it was as if Martha's soul had been removed and replaced with something empty and shattered, something that wore Martha's face but was no longer truly her. Martha was placed back in her second-floor bedroom, the same room she had occupied before her disappearance. But the room had changed. The windows now had locks fitted on the outside. The door had a new lock as well, one that only Thomas could open, and he kept the key with him at all times. The furniture was reduced to the bare minimum: a bed, a chair, a small table. Nothing that could be broken, nothing that could be used as a weapon. A nurse was hired to care for Martha. Her name was Mrs. Abigail Randolph, a strict woman from Charlottesville with experience handling difficult patients. She had worked in a private asylum in Philadelphia and brought with her the methods used there: restraints for violent behavior, sedatives for agitation, and isolation for those deemed uncontrollable. Mrs. Randolph took a small room next to Martha's, connected by a door locked from the nurse's side. She was given full authority over Martha's care. She controlled when Martha ate, when she slept, when she left her bed. She administered laudanum several times a day, keeping Martha in a near constant haze. Mrs. Randolph kept careful records of Martha's condition, noting every OU, T-burst, every refusal to eat, every troubling statement. These records still exist in the Randolph family papers, and they are deeply unsettling. She described Martha as highly agitated, prone to violent sobbing, making wild accusations against her husband, and needing constant supervision to prevent self-harm. She recorded repeated claims that the food was poisoned. She noted several instances where Martha had to be restrained to stop her from leaving the room or hurting herself, but the notes reveal something else as well. They show that Martha had moments of clarity, times when the laudanum faded and her thoughts sharpened. During those moments, she told Mrs. Randolph what had happened at Shadwell Mills. She spoke of the isolation, the fear, the slow and deliberate breaking of her will. She talked about Sally Hemings and the baby, about Thomas's betrayal, about her resolve to tell the truth. Mrs. Randolph wrote these statements down, but she also labeled Martha as delusional, insisting her words could not be trusted. She framed Martha's accusations as the ravings of a sick mind, not the testimony of a woman who had been imprisoned and destroyed. Whether Mrs. Randolph truly believed this or simply chose to believe it remains unclear. Whether she was delusional or whether she was simply trying to protect her employer is impossible to know. The household was informed that Martha's condition had grown worse during her treatment in Richmond, that she required total silence and rest, and that only Thomas and Mrs. Randolph were permitted to enter her room. The servants were strictly forbidden from speaking to Martha or even acknowledging that she was there. If they heard her crying or calling out, they were ordered to ignore it and continue their duties as if nothing was happening. For the next 3 months, Martha Jefferson became a ghost inside her own home. Servants heard her crying late at night, long, aching sobs that echoed through the corridors and caused them to pull their blankets over their heads to block out the sound. They heard her calling out names, her children's names, her sister's name, and sometimes, in a voice filled with bitterness and rage, Sally's name. Sally. Sally Hemings. I know you can hear me. I know what you did. I know what he did. Everyone will know. I will make sure everyone knows. Thomas spent every evening in Martha's room. The servants could hear him through the closed door, reading to her in quiet, steady tones, trying to soothe her agitation. He read from the Bible, from books of philosophy, from poetry. He spoke to her about their children, about their life together, about his love for her. He tried to reach whatever remained of the woman he had once married, but they could also hear Martha's replies, her accusations, her curses, her desperate questions that Thomas never truly answered. Why did you send me away? Why did you lock me in that place? What did you do to me there? What did you give me? Why will you not let me see my children? What have you told them about me? Is the baby born yet? Is it a boy or a girl? Does it look like you? Everyone will know. I will tell everyone. You cannot keep me locked up forever. Thomas's replies were always the same. He told her she was sick, that she needed rest, that she was confused and saying things she did not mean. He told her she would feel better soon, that she would recover, that everything would be fine. He told her he loved her, that he had always loved her, and that he had only done what was necessary to protect her and the family. But Martha did not believe him, and she never stopped trying to escape. Martha's children were not allowed to see her after her disappearance. Patty, who was 9 years old, and Polly, who was only 3, were told that their mother was too ill to have visitors. They were sent away to stay with relatives. Patty went to live with her Aunt Elizabeth Epps. Polly was sent to another family member. They would not see their mother again until it was too late. Patty wrote letters to Martha, simple childish notes full of love and hope for her recovery. These letters were given to Thomas, who promised to read them to Martha. Whether he ever did remains unknown. The letters still exist in the Jefferson family papers, but there are no replies from Martha, no words of love for her daughters, no promises that she would see them again, only silence. In July, Sally Hemings went into labor. The birth was difficult and lasted nearly 2 days. Sally was assisted by Grace, the plantation midwife, an elderly enslaved woman who had delivered dozens of babies at Monticello over many years. Grace had delivered Martha's children. She had delivered the children of Sally's mother. She had watched generations of enslaved families born into bondage, and she had learned to keep her thoughts hidden about what she witnessed. But what she saw during Sally's delivery shocked even her. The baby was born strong and healthy, a boy with light skin and fine features. It was the baby's face that made Grace pause, the shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the way the hair grew at the temples, all of it was unmistakably familiar. The child looked like Thomas Jefferson, not a vague resemblance, but a clear and undeniable similarity that could not be explained away. Grace said nothing. She cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Sally's arms. Sally looked down at her son with an expression that was difficult to read. There was love, yes, but also fear and quiet acceptance. This child would be a living reminder of what had been done to her. This child would bind her to Thomas Jefferson for the rest of her life. Sally named her son Thomas, though everyone called him Tom. The baby thrived, and Sally recovered quickly from the birth. She was young and strong, and her body healed with the resilience of youth. Thomas visited the cabin once, the day after the birth. He stayed less than 5 minutes. He looked at the baby, said nothing, and left. He never held his son. He never acknowledged him openly, but arrangements were made. Sally and her child were moved to a better cabin, one with 2 rooms instead of 1, with a proper fireplace, wooden floors, and real glass windows instead of shutters. Sally received a small monthly allowance, a few coins, something almost unheard of for an enslaved person. She was given better clothing, better food, better treatment overall. It was quietly understood, though never officially stated, that Sally's children would never be sold, would never be separated from her, and would be treated differently from other enslaved children at Monticello. These were not acts of kindness. They were payments, compensation for silence, a transaction between a man with absolute power and a woman with none. Sally knew what had happened to Martha. She had been at Shadwell Mills during those first terrible weeks of Martha's confinement. She had been forced to serve her, to bring her food and water, to clean her room, to listen to her rambling cries and desperate pleas. Sally had heard things no one else had heard, confessions, threats, and plans whispered during Martha's moments of clarity. Plans for revenge that frightened Sally because she knew Martha was capable of carrying them out, even in her broken state. Martha knew about the pregnancy. Martha knew the baby was Thomas's, and Martha had promised Sally that she would make them both pay, that she would expose the truth and destroy Thomas's reputation, even if it cost her own life. Sally was terrified. She had no power to protect herself or her child. She depended entirely on Thomas's favor, and she knew that favor could vanish at any time. She had seen what Thomas did to Martha when Martha became inconvenient. What would he do to Sally if she became dangerous? So Sally stayed silent. She accepted the better cabin, the small allowance, and the promises about her children. She played the role expected of her, the grateful slave, the silent mistress, the woman with no complaints. She buried her fear, her anger, and her knowledge deep inside where no one could reach it. But she never forgot, and she never forgave. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. The official cause of death was listed as complications from childbirth. The delivery of Lucy Elizabeth 15 months earlier had weakened her beyond recovery, and she had finally given in to her long decline. Yet the timing raised questions. Martha had survived for months in her fragile condition, clinging to life with a strength that surprised those around her. Why did she die at that exact moment? Just as her sister Elizabeth was planning another visit to Monticello, just as questions about Martha's condition were becoming harder to avoid, just as the story of her illness was becoming impossible to maintain. The servants who prepared Martha's body for burial noticed things that troubled them. They whispered among themselves, but never spoke of it outside the enslaved community. They knew better than to accuse a master. Betty Brown, who had served Martha for many years, helped wash and dress the body. She noticed bruises on Martha's arms, dark purple marks that looked like fingerprints, as if someone had held her down with great force. She noticed a strange smell on Martha's breath, bitter and chemical, unlike the usual scent of laudanum. She also noticed that Martha's face was frozen not in peaceful rest, but in something closer to fear, her eyes wide, her mouth open as if she had died while screaming. Grace, the midwife, was asked to examine the body. She had attended many deaths over her long life and knew what to look for. After studying Martha closely, she pulled Thomas aside and spoke to him in a low voice that no one else could hear. What she said was never written down, but Thomas's reaction was observed by several people. He turned pale, staggered, and had to sit down. His hands shook as if he had just heard something dreadful or been confronted with an unbearable truth. He dismissed Grace at once, sending her back to the quarters with strict orders not to speak of what she had seen. He commanded that Martha be buried within 24 hours, before the body could further deteriorate in the September heat. This haste was unusual. Wealthy families normally kept the body for several days, allowing relatives to arrive and pay their respects. There would be a viewing, a formal funeral, a proper period of mourning. But Thomas insisted on immediate burial, citing the heat, Martha's condition, and the need to spare the family further pain. The funeral was small and hurried. A few relatives, a few close friends, and a minister who read from the Bible in a brief and detached manner. The coffin was sealed shut. Thomas said Martha's appearance would be too distressing for anyone to see. No one was permitted to view her body one final time. Elizabeth Epps arrived just as the coffin was being lowered into the grove. She had ridden hard from her home after receiving word of Martha's death only the day before. She was furious that she had not been told sooner, that she had been denied the chance to say goodbye, and that her sister was being buried with such shocking haste. She demanded to see Martha one last time. She wanted to look upon her sister's face, to say farewell, and to be certain that Martha was truly dead and not simply being hidden away. Hidden away once more. Thomas refused. He said the coffin had already been sealed, that Martha's body was not fit to be seen, that it would be far too upsetting for Elizabeth to look upon her. He insisted that Elizabeth needed to trust him, that he had acted only in Martha's best interests, that everything had been handled correctly and with care. They argued beside the grave, their voices growing louder as the minutes passed, while the other mourners stood nearby in tense, uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth accused Thomas of concealing the truth. Thomas accused Elizabeth of being overcome by grief and behaving irrationally. The argument became heated and harsh, threatening to turn into a public scene and a lasting scandal. At last, Thomas played his final move. He reminded Elizabeth of the terms written into his will. He reminded her that her children's futures depended on his goodwill, that he had made generous plans to secure their financial stability, and that those plans could easily be altered if Elizabeth chose to be uncooperative. He warned her that spreading rumors about Martha's death would damage not only his own reputation, but her family's standing as well, and that society would never show kindness to a woman who accused her brother-in-law of serious wrongdoing without proof. The message was unmistakable. Silence had its price. Obedience would be rewarded. Resistance would bring consequences. Elizabeth stepped away from the grave. She stood and watched as her sister was buried in silence, her face set in a hard mask of sorrow, anger, and helpless despair. She watched as the earth was thrown down onto the coffin, covering Martha forever, burying the truth along with her. And then she left Monticello and never came back. She cut off all contact with Thomas Jefferson. She refused to visit him. She refused to write to him. She refused to allow her children any relationship with their uncle. For the rest of her life, she kept a cold and distant silence that spoke clearly of what she believed had happened to her sister. But before she left, she did one thing that would echo across history. She took Martha's diary. Martha had kept a journal for many years, writing down her thoughts, her fears, and her observations about life at Monticello. It was a small leather-bound book that she hid beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. She wrote in it almost every day, recording her life in careful detail. The births of her children, the deaths of those she loved, her long illness, and her observations about Thomas, his work, and his character. In the final months, she had written about Sally Hemings, about the pregnancy, about her confrontation with Thomas, and about what had happened to her at Shadwell Mills. After Martha's death, Thomas searched for the diary, planning to destroy it. He went through her room slowly and thoroughly, opening every drawer, searching every trunk, checking every possible hiding place, but he never found it. The diary was gone. Elizabeth had acted faster. While Thomas was busy with funeral arrangements and everyone else was distracted by grief and confusion, Elizabeth went to Martha's room. She knew about the loose floorboard. Martha had shown it to her years earlier, when they were young girls sharing secrets. Elizabeth retrieved the diary, hid it among her own bellows, and carried it with her when she left Monticello. The diary was never published. Elizabeth kept it hidden for the rest of her life, locked away in a trunk in her attic. When she died in 1811, she passed it on to her daughter with strict instructions that it was never to be read by anyone outside the family. She warned that it contained information too dangerous to reveal, that it could destroy reputations and ruin lives even long after the events it described. The diary passed through several generations of the Epps family, each keeper adding a note of their own, confirming that its contents were too disturbing to be made public. It became a family secret, a heavy burden handed down from mother to daughter, proof that something terrible had happened, but something that could never be spoken aloud. In 1873, 91 years after Martha's death, the diary was finally destroyed. Martha's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Caroline Epps Harrison, burned it in her fireplace. She stayed awake all night, reading the diary page by page, then feeding each page into the flames, watching its secrets turn to ash. But before she destroyed it, she wrote a letter to her sister describing what she had read. That letter survived. It is now kept in a private collection held by descendants of the Epps family, never shown publicly and never discussed in official Jefferson scholarship. Access to it is tightly controlled, and historians who ask to see it are usually refused. A few researchers, however, have been allowed to read the letter under strict conditions of secrecy. They report that it contains claims so disturbing that they cannot be published even today, more than 200 years after the events it describes. The letter mentions Shadwell Mills. It mentions Sally Hemings and the child. It describes things done to Martha during her confinement, methods used to break her spirit and secure her silence, and it records Martha's final words spoken to Thomas on the night before she died. According to the letter, Martha asked Thomas to come to her room and spoke to him with a clarity she had not shown in months. The laudanum had worn off, and her mind was clear for the first time since her return from Shadwell Mills. She told him that she knew what he had done to her. She told him she would never forgive him. She said she had written everything down, that the truth would live on even if she did not, that his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would one day know what kind of man he truly was. Then she said, "You sent me away to hide your shame, but shame has a way of surviving. Your children will know, history will know, and you will never escape what you have done." Those were her final words. She died that night, alone in her locked room, with only Mrs. Randolph present. The nurse's official report claimed that Martha died peacefully in her sleep, but Caroline Epps Harrison's letter suggests something very different. It implies that Martha's death was not natural, that steps were taken to ensure she would never speak again, and that the timing was far too convenient to be mere chance. But there is no proof. There is only suspicion, whispers, and a letter that very few have read and even fewer are willing to believe. After Martha's death, Thomas Jefferson destroyed nearly everything connected to her. He burned her letters, hundreds of them, written to family and friends over many years. He destroyed her personal papers, her drawings, her music. He burned her clothing, claiming he could not bear the sight of it. He removed her portraits from the walls and stored them away in the attic, where they collected dust for decades. He forbade anyone in the household from speaking her name, saying it caused him too much pain. He was erasing her from history, just as he had erased the 3 months when she vanished. He was shaping a story in which Martha was simply a tragic wife who died young, a victim of illness rather than a woman slowly destroyed by betrayal and cruelty. The official record of Martha Jefferson's life is strikingly thin. We know when she was born and when she died. We know she married Thomas Jefferson in 1772. We know she gave birth to 6 children, only 2 of whom lived to adulthood. We know she died at the age of 33, supposedly from complications related to childbirth, but we know almost nothing about who she truly was. Her letters were burned, her diary was destroyed. Her voice was silenced during her life and after her death. She remains in history as a shadow, a footnote in the story of a powerful man, a wife who died young and left her husband free to pursue his ambitions. Sally Hemings remained at Monticello for the rest of Thomas Jefferson's life. She bore him 6 children in total, though only 4 survived into adulthood. Their names were Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. They all had light skin, light enough to pass as white, and they closely resembled Thomas Jefferson. He never publicly acknowledged them. He never freed Sally while he was alive, but he did make arrangements in his will to free her children when they reached adulthood. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to leave in their early 20s, disappearing into white society and never returning. Madison and Eston were formally freed after Thomas's death. Sally herself was never officially freed. Instead, she was allowed to walk away after Thomas died in 1826, a legal fiction that granted her freedom without formal paperwork that might raise questions about why she alone, among hundreds of enslaved people, received such treatment. She lived with her sons Madison and Eston in Charlottesville until her death in 1835. She never spoke publicly about her relationship with Thomas Jefferson. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, and never confirmed or denied the rumors that followed her for decades. She kept a dignified silence that protected her children and preserved what little privacy she had left. But she told her children stories. She told them about their father, about life at Monticello, and about the painful reality of being enslaved by the man who fathered your children. She told them about Martha Jefferson, about what happened in 1782, and about the terrible cost Martha paid for learning the truth. Her children told their own children, and those stories survived even as official history tried to bury them. For generations, the Hemings family maintained that they were descended from Thomas Jefferson, that Sally Hemings had been his concubine, and that the relationship began when Sally was still a teenager and continued for many years. For 200 years, these claims were dismissed by historians and Jefferson scholars. They argued that such a relationship was impossible, that a man of Jefferson's position would never behave in that way, and that the Hemings family was lying, mistaken, or seeking a connection to greatness they did not deserve. But in 1998, DNA testing confirmed what the Hemings descendants had always said. Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one of Sally Hemings' children, and very likely all of them. The genetic proof could not be denied. The official history had been wrong. The family stories had been telling the truth all along. The stone house at Shadwell Mills burned down in 1798, years after Martha died. The fire was declared an accident, a lightning strike during a summer storm. According to the official report, the house was fully destroyed. The stone walls split from the heat, the roof fell in, everything inside turned to ash. But the timing raised doubts. The fire happened only days after a fair